Hey everybody, thanks very much for watching. So it's been a little while since I've uploaded anything new because I took a break over the summer. But now we're back and we're fully in the swing of A-level RS. I thought I would have a little look at an aspect of religious language that my students at least have been finding a little bit tricky, which is the debate about whether religious language is cognitive or non-cognitive. So I'm going to take you through that briefly today. Let's go. So definitions, this is the easy part, but it still can be a little bit confusing if this just isn't terminology that you're used to using. So what we tend to mean by cognitive language is when we're using language cognitively, it conveys factual information and it's open to checking. So the example we've got here, I think this is an example possibly from the textbook or the revision guide. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris. That's an example of a cognitive statement, because when we say that, we're trying to express something which is factual information, and if we want to find out if it's true or not, we know how to do it. So this is an example of a cognitive statement that's also a synthetic statement. So a synthetic statement is open to being checked through evidence. Some cognitive statements are analytic. That tends to be something like 2 + 2 is 4 is an analytic statement, or a bachelor is an unmarried man is an analytic statement, because it contains its own kind of truth or verification. You don't need to go and check. The Eiffel Tower being in Paris is not true by definition. It doesn't have to be true because the Eiffel Tower could be somewhere else. But if we go and check, we'll find that it is in fact in Paris. So cognitive language is where we're using language in this very kind of factual, not always literal, but more literal way. Now, non-cognitive language is a little bit different. This conveys information that cannot be evaluated as true or false. So we can't check whether cognitive language is true or false. So the example I've got here is stealing is wrong. That's an example of a non-cognitive statement because it's not expressing a fact, it's expressing disapproval. If we changed it to stealing is illegal, that would be cognitive and factual and checkable because you could look at the law and see whether stealing is illegal. But stealing is wrong. That's saying something different. That's a moral judgment. So non-cognitive statements aren't really about conveying facts. They're about expressing how we feel. They're about trying to influence the behaviour of others. And we can't test whether they're empirically true or false. Now, in our lives, we use both these kinds of language. We use cognitive language all the time, but we also use non-cognitive language all the time. It depends what we're trying to do and what we're trying to say. And this is where we get into it a little bit with religious language, because one of the big debates in this topic, and one of the ways that we can use the scholars we've studied, is to try and have this discussion about, is religious language cognitive or non-cognitive? So let's have a look at some examples. So there are times when religious statements are being used cognitively. So if a Christian, for example, were to say, God exists, at the time when they're saying it, because they are a Christian, they are going to be saying that as if it is a fact, because to them it is a fact. So when they say that, they're treating it as a factual assertion about the existence of a deity. So that's a real God that really exists. Another one could be miracles happen. So again, that's a cognitive example because we could investigate and check that. We might not be able to absolutely verify or falsify it, but we could have a go. Ayer and Flew, who are, remember, you scholars for the verification principle and the falsification principle, they would say that these claims are meaningless because even though we might be able to try to verify them, actually we can't. Equally, you can't falsify them because if a religious believer believes that these things are true, they won't accept any evidence to the contrary. So even though they're being used cognitively, people like Ayer and Flew would say that they have no factual content, therefore they are meaningless. John Hick's got another take. Hick thinks it's fair enough for some of these statements to be seen as cognitive and meaningful, because his argument, if you remember, is that we can actually verify them, we just can't do it yet. Hick believes in eschatological verification. Eschatological means at the end. So his view is basically that, you can claim God exists, we can't verify that at the moment, but you find out when you die, and therefore it can be verified, so it is meaningful and it is cognitive, because either it's true or it's false. It can be checked when we die. Now, some non-cognitive examples. These could be things like God is love. So if a religious believer said God is love, they might not be saying that in a truly factual, straightforward way. They might be expressing a particular belief or attitude or feeling that they have, rather than trying to get across a fact. Equally, something like heaven is a place of peace. This could be symbolic, it could be metaphorical, it could be expressing something like hope. Heaven is a place of peace doesn't necessarily refer to there is a literal place called heaven, it is a geographical location, and there it is peaceful. When religious believers say things like that, they don't normally mean it that literally. So, non-cognitive language, does it work? Is it meaningful? Wittgenstein says yes. Things like this work as part of a language game, because the people who are saying them, they know that they're not factually provable, but it doesn't really matter because they make sense in context. If two religious believers are having a discussion about the nature of God, the nature of heaven, it may not make sense to outsiders, it may not be testable, but the people in that conversation will know what they're talking about. So they're speaking non-cognitively, but they are speaking meaningfully. Tillich as well, who thinks that all religious language is symbolic, thinks that these are words that perhaps are not terribly adequate on their own, but they're symbolic expressions that are conveying deeper truths. And those deeper truths can't be subjected to testing. And then if you want a third take on this, Hare, so this is R.M. Hare, he thinks that all religious language is an expression of a blick. So a blick is our individual worldview. So it almost doesn't matter whether it's true or false. If it's part of how you see the world, it's meaningful to you. So we've got some good examples there on those last two slides of sometimes when religious language is cognitive and sometimes when it's non-cognitive. And this is very much where I'm going with this. I think it can be both. There are views that are kind of in the middle. There are views that are trying to dodge the whole problem of whether religious language is cognitive or non-cognitive. So I think Aquinas is quite a good example of this. Aquinas' approach is all about analogy. So he's got analogy of proportion, analogy of attribution. I'm not going to massively go through those now, but his point is when we talk about God, we're talking about something we can't understand. So it's not about are we dealing in facts or not? It's about can we say something about God in a way that makes sense to us? So we're never going to get all the way there. There's no way to talk about God accurately. So analogy is the best we can do. So his example, well, it wasn't his example to be fair, but an example that we could use for analogy of proportion is to say that, we might be able to understand the loyalty of a dog. From that, we can compare it to the loyalty of a human and say, well, yeah, dogs are loyal, but humans are capable of loyalty on a greater level. And then we can kind of project up to God and then say the loyalty that God has must be far, far greater than humans because God is greater than us, just like we are greater than dogs. It's not perfect, And I think if Aquinas could talk to us about it today, he would admit that. But he's not trying to be perfect. He's just trying to show that this is a way of talking about God without getting bogged down in what's a fact and what's not a fact. Now, why is there even a debate? And we have to engage with the debate because this could be part of a 15-mark answer, it could be part of a dialogues. So the red box here, quite a lot of religious believers would say that they actually are speaking factually and cognitively when they say things like God exists. So to them, that's not a metaphor, it's not a symbol, it's a fact. And it's not just an expression of a belief. To them, it is completely and utterly true. And also we've got a second thing, which is if all religious statements are non-cognitive, what are we actually left with? What factual content is there in religion? Christianity in particular has this issue because Christianity is based on a set of historical facts about a man called Jesus who lived in first century Palestine. If everything is just a metaphor, then what's really left? What's the basis of the faith? So this is why some Christians think it's very important to argue that actually not all religious language is non-cognitive. Some of it is clearly cognitive, it's factual. But then on the green side, as humans, we use language non-cognitively all the time. So there shouldn't be any problem with using religious language this way. So, for example, if you tell somebody that you love them, that's a non-cognitive statement because you're expressing a feeling or an emotion there. You can't do a scientific test to see whether you love someone. So if we use language non-cognitively in a non-religious context, it shouldn't be massively difficult to use it in a religious context. And the other point I'm making here is the mistake that Ayer and Flue made. The verification principle and the falsification principle, those challenges only work if religious language is trying to do the same things as scientific language. And most of the time, it's fairly obvious that it isn't. There might be exceptions to that, but most religious language isn't the same kind of thing as scientific language. All right, so we're coming to the end. I would say the best conclusion to draw is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. Sometimes religious language is being used cognitively and sometimes it's being used non-cognitively. So if you were to get a 15-mark answer on this, as my class have just had, it can be tempting to think that for your conclusion, you have to pick one. This is one of those times where I don't think you do. I think it's absolutely reasonable, probably the most reasonable course of action to go down the middle and say, well, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. As long as you can back that up, that's absolutely fine. And I'm going to back it up right now. So again, this is Hick giving an example of a time when it can be cognitive and a time when it can be non-cognitive. So if you were to say there is life after death, that could be cognitive because Hick argues that that's verifiable at the end of life. There either is life after death or there isn't, and we find out when we die. But then something like Adam and Eve sinned and were punished. If a Christian says that, they're not necessarily communicating a fact, because if they see that story as a myth, what they're probably dealing in is some kind of personal truth about flawed human nature, alienation from God, a bigger, broader truth about the relationship between God and humans. And those events involving Adam and Eve don't literally have to have taken place in order for that message to be meaningful. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I hope that's helped. I'm going to be going on maternity leave soon, so the number of videos is probably going to drop off, but I will try and squeeze in a few more. I will take requests, leave a comment, and work hard, and I'll see you soon.